everyone in storytelling land. Let's welcome Dwight Stackhouse.
Good evening. There are many of us here on the planet. We cover the human rainbow, red, yellow, black, white, the ever increasing brown. I once had a friend I want to tell you about who fell under the red banner, but he could, and for most of his life he did, pass for white. He was steeped in pride and overwhelmed by prejudice. He had sad eyes, deep, bottomless eyes. Even when he smiled, his eyes were sad. They dominated his countenance. You could rewind his life if you gazed long enough into his eyes. I met him when we were young men in our 20s and both suffering in the ordinary ways that life demanded. We were friends for 10 years and we worked together in retail. You know how that is, or was. Lots of long hours, lots of downtime, which gave us lots of time to talk. He was with me when I broke down publicly, crying so desperately that they had to call an ambulance when it finally dawned on me that I had left my children. He was handsome, and in some ways he was very proud of his native status, but in other ways, many other ways, he was absolutely ashamed of being who he was. The world has the power to do that, make you hate yourself, your black, your yellow, your red, your brown self. He tried to live an impossible imitation of life. Having been born on a reservation, the ways of his people were very well known to him and satisfying enough. They were, after all, members of the Anishinaabe, or said, when translated, the original people. Now, that fact was a source of great pride in his family, but it was only discussed with his drunken uncles during colloquies, and these men could find no way to jibe that noble history with their current condition, being controlled and humiliated by white men who confined them to reservations. Now, however true or false the stereotype is of the Native American's inability to hold his liquor, alcohol was a problem in his family. There on the reservation, a place he almost never spoke of, he learned that he was less than other humans. This humiliation, this heritable knowledge led him to follow in his uncle's moccasins. Like them, he began drinking early in life and was a full-blown alcoholic by the age of 14. When we went to lunch, his lunch was a six-pack of beer. He was ridiculed on the plantation, or I should say on the reservation, because of his European appearance. His hair, which was as black as space itself, was the only physical trait he had that suggested his native heritage. He was teased on the reservation, called a paleface. And one day when he and his family left the compound to buy shoes that they couldn't get on the reservation, he got separated from his uncles who had found their way to the only bar in town that would serve them. So he was lost on the street and he meandered over to the wrong side of town, where he had to listen to the locals ridicule him and his kin, calling them Indians and Wahoos, Redskins, and worse. But it was clear that they didn't see him as a Native American. And this gave him the idea that he could leave the pain of his life on the reservation and enter the world he so envied. At 16, he left home. He had very little formal education, but he was very accomplished at mimicry and practiced in the ways of white men, learning to speak and walk like them. In the age of polyester, he was awash in it. All those hideous plaids and bell bottoms. He wore wingtip shoes and the other classic garb of the white boys of that era. He became a follower, a sycophant. The intention was simply to learn the ways of white men, to blend in, but it morphed into the habits of a bootlicker. At some point, he lost himself. It was imperceptible at first. He had become simply an affectation. Self-loathing followed him like he followed his oppressors, the very people who heaped all manner of prejudice upon him and his family. He could not help himself. He wanted what he believed them to have. He wanted to be them, and his appearance allowed that fantasy to flourish. But visions of his former life would not release him. The memory of the shanty in which he was born and raised, the despair of pervasive ugliness, drunkenness, and drug abuse haunted him. His family was still there. They were like nightmares swirling in his head. He decided to cloak the nightmares with the purchase of a house in the suburbs where no natives were welcome. He surrounded himself by his heroes, and it gave him real satisfaction. He littered his life with the accoutrements of his idols. He actually had a white picket fence built. It was like a totem for him. His handsome affability allowed him to acquire things, baubles he would show off and brag about. He found a white woman to marry who bristled watching him cower and defer to everyone else. She simply couldn't understand it until, in the throes of one of his drunken bouts, he confessed his gentry to his friends, and in the presence of his wife, who was hearing it for the first time. She was mortified. "So you're a damned Indian?" she said. She said this with the surprise of hearing something disgusting, grotesque, and inappropriate. The crowd, his friends, as sloshed as he was, joined in. "Hey, Darlene, you married a goddamn redskin. Well, I'll be damned. We're hanging out with Chief Wahoo." And the laughter began. And it would not end. They started calling him Chief, and they shared this gossip with everyone in their circle. Darlene, his wife, became distant, feeling diminished and deceived. His good looks, his acquisitions meant nothing. She stopped sharing herself with him, saying, "At least I didn't get pregnant, thank God." When he sobered up, he did not remember the confession, but he could not escape the derision it fomented. "I hate these motherfuckers," he told me, downing the fourth beer during our 1-hour lunch. "They're not better than me. I'm as good as any of these white bastards. I got as much money as they do. My house is as nice as theirs. Who the fuck do they think they are?" I hate these assholes. I swear I'm going to shoot somebody. This is the 70s, and that statement was just hyperbole back then. And I was not alarmed by it, but there was madness on his face. There was anger in those sad eyes, compounded by the alcohol. He had told me he was an Indian, and he was taken by my fascination of the culture. And I was humbled in my ignorance. We bonded in this way, as I, a black man in America, had anger of my own. This gave him permission to ramble, or more precisely, to boil. His drunkenness became a constant. He wasn't simply an alcoholic. He was a constant drunk. He was drunk at 8 a.m. and he seethed all of the time. He could find no peace. It wasn't long before his wife left him. He was fired from his job. His polyester haberdashery was retired, and he began wearing tattered jeans and dirty t-shirts. He lost his house. When I last saw him, he was finally dark of skin, dark in the way that homelessness provides one with color. Even his teeth had gone brown. He barely recognized me. That is to say, he could not find words intelligible enough for me to know it. I missed my friend. I missed him for years. And then I heard, some years later, that he went into the forest with a case of Budweiser and a shotgun. And he sat down on one of the fallen trees in the forest and started tossing those Budweisers down. With 3 left in the case, he decided indeed it was time to shoot somebody. He put the rifle to his chin and pulled the trigger. The pellets exited the barrel of the rifle and his cranium. He was found the next day by white hunters, and there was no sadness in his eyes. It had transferred to mine. His pride was deep and wide. The prejudice could not be surmounted. I think often about my friend, and I think often about the twisted power of pride and prejudice. Thank you.